Roger, once again, Mud Fossil University, and as promised, we are going to go into the history of our world and what was written. And I have been studying basically all of the old texts, Herodotus and Hesiod and Plato is extremely articulate at presenting everything there was to know about Atlantis. And he got this from his great-grandfather, or it was one of his great relatives called Solon, who had originally spent 10 years in Egypt studying with the priests shortly after Atlantis collapsed and they escaped to the highlands in Ethiopia and then over into Egypt. So Solon was highly regarded as a man of truth and one of the wisest of the seven sages. And this is his account passed down to Plato. And Plato and all of these other guys sat around, Plato and Socrates and Christus and Timaeus and they sat around and they recorded the history that was said to be the true history. And as far as I can determine, it was very accurate. Now, what we're going to go into now is a book called The Antediluvian World. It was by, hold on a second. These are audio recordings, so there's no pictures or anything to look at, so you might not be interested. but this is a very detailed account of Atlantis, and it was called The Antediluvian World Part 1, Tales, Legends, Myths, and it's an audio book, Ancient Lemuria, Atlantis, and it's by a guy named Ignatius L. Donnelly, and he wrote this book, and it was published in 1882. So he did a lot of research, and I can tell, he read Plato basically, and he talked about it in great detail. So what I want to explain to you is that Atlantis was in the ocean outside of the Mediterranean Sea out towards the Atlantic, but it was not right off the coast of the Hercules, Pillars of Hercules. There was another pillars south of there in the Atlantic, in the Sahara Desert. Well, it was an ocean at that time, and it was separated off by the Atlas Mountains. And Atlantis was right in the crux, going from the ocean out into the Atlantic, and it sat there as a sentinel, really, to guide in and out from inland Sahara out into the Atlantic. Now, it speaks of a time when the gods were here and they actually divided up the earth, and they gave Poseidon Atlantis. And Poseidon now constructs a place for his bride, who is the daughter of one of the ancients, whose mother and father died, and Poseidon took her and created Atlantis basically for her and for his life. And it goes into the details of how it was created. He carved it like carving it from a lathe, and he did all these things, and they coated it with all these different metals, bronze and tin and auriculum, which is the platinum group metals, and extremely detailed account from Plato. So as I go through this, I'm going to clip in here and there to places where there's significance, and I'm going to do one right now. This is the allotment of the world by the gods, and this goes on to talk about Atlantis.
The Antediluvian World by Ignatius Loyola Donnelly. The tale, which was of great length, began as follows. I have before remarked, in speaking of the allotments of the gods, that they distributed the whole earth into portions differing in extent, and made themselves temples and sacrifices. And Poseidon, receiving for his lot the island of Atlantis, begat children by a mortal woman, and settled them in a part of the island which I will proceed to describe. On the side toward the sea, and in the center of the whole island, there was a plain which is said to have been the fairest of all plains, and very fertile. Near the plain again, and also in the center of the island, at a distance of about 50 stadia, there was a mountain, not very high on any side.
The stadia, I believe, are 600 and something feet, 606 feet, something like that, in length.
In this mountain there dwelt one of the earth-born primeval men of that country, whose name was Evenor, and he had a wife named Leucippe, and they had an old daughter who was named Cleito. The maiden was growing up to womanhood when her father and mother died. Poseidon fell in love with her and had intercourse with her, and breaking the ground, enclosed the hill in which she dwelt all around, making alternate zones of sea and land, larger and smaller, encircling one another. There were 2 of land and 3 of water, which he turned as with a lathe out of the center of the island, equidistant every way, so that no man could get to the island, for ships and voyages were not yet heard of.
All right, that is a critical part. All right, remember that, because we're talking about Atlantis. We're talking about this particular location. It's called the Eye of the Sahara, and critical to understand is, at this point there was no ships, there was no voyages. So my point being is that there's a lot of speculation about all these old cultures that were all over the earth, and Atlantis was just an extension of those. Well, I take exception to that. I say that Atlantis was the predecessor to these other cultures, and that Atlantis could possibly have sent around the world, and which I do believe is a fact, and they were the long-headed people. And they were extremely sophisticated in every single way, and were literally gods. And they did, once Atlantis collapsed, they did go throughout the world, and they may have been throughout the world as Atlantis was in its heyday as well, I'm sure. But these things did not precede Atlantis. Atlantis preceded these things. That's my statement based on the fact that there was no ships, no voyages prior to this. All right, this part talks about the apportioning of the islands and then all of the surrounding islands, which I have found as well. And listen to this now.
Gave the names Mnesius to the elder, and Autochthon to the one who followed him. Of the 4th pair of twins, he called the elder Elasippus, and the younger Mestor. And of the 5th pair, he gave to the elder the name of Azais, and to the younger Diaprepes. All these and their descendants were the inhabitants and rulers of diverse islands in the open sea.
All right, there's the key. Diverse islands in the open sea. And there was several of them that I have found that mimic Atlantis in a much smaller scale, but right in that particular area. And it appears that that's what they did. They colonized this particular location and set it up as like a family business run out of that particular area. And then it seems that they colonized the world from there, and they were apparently bullies. And it goes on to speak of the encounter between the Athenians, which were in Greece, were the only ones that would stand up to the Atlanteans. And that's the crux of the nature of the fight between the Greeks and the Atlanteans.
The inhabitants and rulers of diverse islands in the open sea, and also, as has been already said, They held sway in the other direction over the country within the pillars as far as Egypt and Tyrrhenia. Now Atlas had a numerous and honorable family, and his eldest branch always retained the kingdom, which the eldest son handed on to his eldest for many generations, and they had such an amount of wealth as was never before possessed by kings and potentates, and is not likely ever to be again, and they were furnished with everything which they could have, both in city and country. For, because of the greatness of their empire, many things were brought to them from foreign countries, and the island itself provided much of what was required by them for the uses of life. In the first place, they dug out of the earth whatever was to be found there, mineral as well as metal, and that which is now only a name, and was then something more than a name, orichalcum, was dug out of the earth in many parts of the island, and, with the exception of gold, was esteemed the most precious of metals among the men of those days. There was an abundance of wood for carpenters' work, and sufficient maintenance for tame and wild animals.
It goes on and on and on to describe every little detail of their existence. All the types of woods and the food and the trees and the plants and how every single detail is so vividly portrayed in this book by Plato that I find it very difficult to discount it whatsoever. And having seen the actual physical remnants of the eye of the Sahara, I see no difference whatsoever. The metals are there. I can see the transition metal elements that are coating the desert floor there in those circles. There's nothing here that I can dispute whatsoever that was said. Now, this is where Atlantis is. Right there. That's the eye of the Sahara. All right, you see all of this stuff has washed away off of the Sahara Ocean, which was the entire area here. All of this sand was the Atlantic Ocean. All the way down here, the Sahara Ocean. Now there's some highlands and highlands over in Ethiopia where they did escape to because there was no place else for them to go once it collapsed. Now, I believe doing all the mining they did was the cause of the dropping of Atlantis. The whole thing collapsed, and it happened in one day, they said. And more mud ran out here. Plato said they will never speak of mud flowing again. And it actually created the Cape Verde Islands out here, maybe a little volcano, but it came out, and they say that the entire Atlantic area here is completely covered with sediments, and they had said that it was an offshore crash 60,000 years ago, and that's not correct. It was an onshore break. All the water ran out, carried all the sediment into the ocean. Plato puts this at 11,004 to 600 years ago. I'd say 11,004 in that area, 11,005. Now, when we go in deeper here, you heard what they said about everybody had their own little spots. I'm going to come in here. Here's the Eye of Sahara. There it is right there. Now, what is this right here? You see these? There's another one right there. And that comes in off the ocean into a circular sort of thing, the same as we saw over there. And there's other ones out here too. As you go out deeper here, here and there, I found them, but I'm going to have a hard time finding them right off the bat now. But they were obviously had their own little spots in this area. So that is what I am saying is Atlantis, and that is the collapse of Atlantis. When they left here, they went over this way to the highlands of Ethiopia, and they were taken in. The Ethiopians attacked them, and it says that they turned them into stone, literally turned them into stone as they attacked. And then they were gentle to them and released them out of this stone state, and they came and begged at their feet for forgiveness. And that's how they became the gods and the rulers of all these, infantile type, childish round-headed people that they were you know, they weren't sophisticated, and they weren't aware of the ways of the world like the Atlanteans were. So they perceived them as gods, which they in fact were.
Of sea which surrounded the ancient metropolis, and made a passage into and out of, they began to build the palace in the royal palace, and then the habitation of the god and of their ancestors. This they continued to ornament in successive generations, every king surpassing the one who came before him to the utmost of his power, until they made the building a marvel to behold for size and for beauty. And beginning from the sea, they dug a canal 300 feet in width and 100 feet in depth.
All right, 300 feet in width and 100 feet in depth. Now I have found the entrance to Atlantis from the ocean, and it I can't be certain, but it's in that range, and you can see that there is channels running from the ocean into the Atlantis ports, and every single slip has its own entrance to the sea. Every single one, and there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of them. And they're all about 20 feet wide. Well, not all of them, but the vast majority are approximately 20 feet wide or so. And I would assume that that would take on a pretty reasonably good size. That's 20 feet wide of a ship, so that's not a small ship. Now, if you want to go digging around out here by yourself, here's Atlantis right here. Let's go in and I'll show you where you can start looking. Because I found all the entrances and all the boats, and I mean, I think the boats are still there. Now, I'm going to come into this area here. There's another ring out here, and you can find where these channels come in out in the ocean, but they all feed. You can see these channels come in. You see this? And then they end up coming in and porting up here. So let's go look at that. All right, now if you know anything about boats and channels, these are channels coming in here, and then they slice off, and then they make this kind of a thing, and every one of these has its own entrance. Now watch how many there are here. You see that? You see those little stripes? They're not just stripes for nothing. Those are slips, and I believe these are the actual boats possibly, or there's some kind of plants or something growing there. I have no clue because I'm not there. However, I can tell you one thing for a fact. There's no question in anyone's mind that I could imagine that would say, well, why are all these things attached like that? Why are all they separated out like that? Why are they all like on the coast? And why is on the other side of this ring these things here that look like buildings? And why are they also going in and they have their own channels? And then they make a channel out here to a main channel that goes to the next ring. These colors are colors of transition metals. These metals here are on the surface, and they are transition metals. And transition metals are exactly what they said they coated the entire thing with. And in addition to that, the walls are made of what they call breccia. Breccia is broken bits of leftover rock that they had mined from under. They took the breccia out and they made their walls. They took the metals out and they coated the walls with metal. Oraculum, which is the thing that he's talking about, the very most precious of all except gold, is the platinum group metals that are outside of gold apparently. And those they're very precious, and they kept the ocean and all of the things from corroding and destroying. But sitting here, you can see the obviously colors here, and those are transition metals. So everything that it was written appears to be correct as far as I can tell. And if you come back here, you'll find that there was a straits right up here, and they had it manned. They had this straits manned. I don't know if I'll be able to find it very easily, but it runs along this particular area here. You see this? It was manned at each side. This was the straits that allowed them to get in and out, and it broke over that wall and collapsed down through the whole section here and destroyed Atlantis. And at the same time drained the entire Sahara Ocean. They find whales' bones and all kinds of things in here. So this was written about. This is the Atlantis Mountains. Atlantis is right there, and Herodotus puts it on his own map. I'll show you that. All right, this is 450 BC. It's right there, Atlantis. Atlantis. Now, Herodotus was the greatest historian ever. He wrote every single detail, and he traveled the entire world. Now, let's go back to Herodotus. He's around 450, 500 BC, in that area. Now, he was the father of history. He wrote the histories, and I read them, and they are fabulous. I mean, he gets down to how this guy took off with the daughter of the king of this place, and they absconded with this guy's wife, and I mean, and it was the details, so detailed, it's incredible. But he claims that he doesn't know this for a fact, but these are the stories that he was told, and he recorded them faithfully. So what ends up happening is they ended up being true. At the time, they destroyed him too. They know he's the father of all lies. Well, he's the father of all history, and he wasn't a liar, I can tell you that. Everything that I've seen that he wrote, I can see substance. Take it however you want to take it, but I see substance. And Herodotus talked about Atlantis and in great detail, and about the Atlantis and the Greek from the Athens having this enormous conflict, and the Athenians were thought of throughout history as a great and marvelous, bold race of people that stood up. This is where you want to go to look at the different videos that I have related to Atlantis, and there's all kinds of things in here. But Atlantis is right here. Atlantis, the fleet may be preserved, and it shows all of the evidence that in a little more detail than we just went in. And then there's other information in here about the seaport and about all kinds of things, the first material ancient timeline. This is something you should certainly watch, because this talks of the timeline of our ancient history. And it's way different than we were told. Extremely way different.